So just have a basic index.html page here. Just has this page right here, service workers tutorial. I've attached a script, and that script is going to inject the service worker, the sw.js. So let's move on to the script here. So we need somewhere to save the registration of the service worker. So let registration equal null. And then let's create two functions. One which registers the service worker. So register service worker. And let me copy that, paste that here. And one which just unregisters the service worker. All right, so first we need to check if we can actually have a service worker in the browser. Not all browsers support service workers. Most do, but just in case, we do an if service worker in a navigator object. And so the navigator object is in the window object. So in the window, there's a navigator object. In the navigator object, there's a service worker object. And then in the service worker, there's a method called register. Two arguments to register. The first is the file name of the service worker. In this case, mine is the sw.js. So sw.js. The second is the scope. It's an option. So scope of, and we'll do this. Now let me explain scope. So right now the sw.js is within the, you could say the general scope, the main scope where the index is. And so the sw.js will have access to all these files. This will be important when we cache local files later on in the video. If I had something like this where there was a temp folder and my sw.js was in the temp folder, and so I had to change this to /temp/ sw.js would not have access or the ability to cache the obj, the script, and the index.html. The scope of your service worker is wherever the folder it's in, its parent folder. It can't go up, it can only go down. So anything in the temp folder, now the obj is in the temp folder, we can cache the obj. If there's another folder within temp called, I don't know, Ajax, we can cache everything within the Ajax folder. So all the scope means is, and of course I'd have to change this to the /temp/. Anything within the SW or wherever the service worker is fair game. Any subdirectories is fair game. Any higher directories is not fair game. So let me just reset this hierarchy. obj back to general directory. sw.js back to general directory. I can delete all these two folders here. And I can change this back to just general directory as well as this. So that's a scope. Now this is a promise. So if we've successfully registered, we'll get a then. Let me just do this. And if we don't successfully register, if there's some sort of error, we'll get a catch. So let me do this. Console.log, service worker successfully, is there two S's there? Yeah, successfully registered. And of course, we're going to save it. So we're just going to say the registration is equal to the res that comes back. And if not, we'll just say here, we'll say, no, could not register service worker. There you go. So that's what registering a service worker looks like. Let's just write the unregister really quickly. So we're just going to say navigator as well. Navigator, service worker, get registration. So all of the registrations. Then we get the registrations back. Registrations. And we'll loop through. I'm just going to unregister all of the service workers. So registrations dot for each registration. And we'll just say registration with the s dot unregister. There you go. Console.log service worker unregistered. Else right here we'll do a catch. Error. And console.log as well. Console.log could not unregister service worker. There we go. So just to test that we have a successful register, let's do this. Let's call the register service worker before I save, because it will automatically refresh. Let me just type something in here. Console.log service worker. Save that. Save that. Let's go back to our page. And there we go. Service worker. So the SW file, not injected, but it linked up. So the service worker linked up. And of course, we get the service worker successfully registered. I spelled that wrong. Let's go back here. Registered. Ah, yes. Registered. Doesn't really matter, but registered. All right, there we go. So the script is successfully linking the service worker. Now, what do we do with the service worker? Let's do this. Actually, let's try this first. Let's go unregister just to see if this one works. So comment that out, save that, and service worker unregistered. Perfect. And let me just show you this. So when we register a service worker, under your Chrome Tools application, you'll be able to see it here. So there's a service worker we registered. When we create a cache, a local cache, you'll be able to see that here under cache storage. Currently, we don't have any, but that's where it's going to be. So let me go back to, we can unregister this way. So just click that. All right, perfect. Let's move on to the service worker then. And so all a service worker is just a file that gets run in between fetch calls of your website. So when you first execute or run your website, the first file that gets fetched, literally with a fetch call, is the index.html. Since the index.html links the script, the second file would be the script.js. And if you had images in here, like image with a source equals to obj, like that, obj would be fetched locally. And so all a service worker does, like I showed you in the little intro there, is it runs in between these fetch calls. Your service worker doesn't actually have to do anything. You could simply say, like what I did in the intro, console.log. But what we primarily use it for is to intercept fetch calls that would go out to across your internet. And so instead of using your bandwidth, we fetch locally and then save that in the cache. You'll see when we go through the process. Anyway, so the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to set up a way to show you guys how we're intercepting fetch calls. So we'll just do window.add-event-listener. We'll do a click. We'll listen for a click. We don't need the event. And every time we click, we're just going to fetch a local resource. This would absolutely work with non-local or remote resources, but we're just going to do local resources. So every time I click the mouse button, we're going to fetch this obj.png. And we're just going to print out what we got in the response for it. So res, and then we'll do console.log, and I'll say from script.js, I got the response like that. Let's test this to see if it's working. Let me save that file here. All right, so I click, and there, that's the response we get. So we sent out a fetch, a request object for the obj, and the response we got is the localhost port 5500 obj.png. So let's move on to actually writing the service worker. So initially when your service worker registers, it goes through certain events, life cycles. The first life cycle or event is called the install event. So we just need to add in event listener. All self is, well, you're probably familiar with this. This is the current context of whatever scope you're in. So if you had a function, this would refer to the function. This would refer to a more global scope. If you had a different function, this would refer to that function. All self refers to is the global scope of the service worker. So self.add-event-listener will listen for the install event. We need the event. And it's in here that we do things like cache local assets. But it's important to note that this thing runs right away. So as soon as the service worker registers, it installs right away. In order for us to wait and actually do something before the install process completes, we have to use the event.waitUntil, you could say, object. It takes a promise in the form of, you can do anything in here, but we're just going to set up a cache. You can put like a new promise like this, resolve, and then resolve some sort of whatever. But we're going to use this to set up a cache. So we do caches. It's an API of JavaScript. We'll do an open. We'll open the version 1 of our cache. We get the cache like this. Then we'll just add things to the cache. Let me do this. Let me add a catch just in case there's an error. A console.log could not cache. All right, so how do we add things to the cache? We can do two ways. Cache.add. We can add single items like this, whatever we want to do. In this case, we could do something like /index.html. And then we can do another cache.add, whatever. But since we're going to do a bunch of caches, we'll just do cache add all. And I'll explain how it's caching things in a second. So this takes an array. The first thing is going to be the index.html. That's the first file that gets fetched when you load your web page, index.html. The index.html links or includes the script.js, so let's cache that on the local side. And then let's cache the obj/obj.png. .png. All right, so what exactly is cache doing? Well, it's just creating key value pairs. It's creating objects like this. Where there's some sort of key, there's some sort of value. What's the key and the value in a cache? Well, it's just request and response objects. Literally HTTP. Request is your key, and the response, the HTTP response, is the value. Literally the same thing. So in requests, you have things like headers and body. That's literally what it's caching. So you could say that the cache is doing something like this. It's fetching each one of these resources, and for the value, it's just getting back the response, whatever the response is. So let me delete this, put it back to here. So that's how we are caching assets. Let me delete all this stuff. And what's wrong with this? Double quotes? No. All right. And then I'll just put when we do this, just put a console.log, not group, console.log. We'll say, assets cached. Cached like this. Let's save. Let's run or register the service worker and see what we get. So save this, go back here. Service worker successfully registered, assets cached. Let's check the tools here, the application. So the service worker is right here, and as I said in the little intro, the cache is right here. So the version 1, which we called it, the V1, that's the cache. So we've successfully cached or stored these local assets or files locally on the cache. There's the index, there's the obj, and there's script.js. Now I'm going to copy and paste some code because it's a bit of a pain to write, and then I'll go through it with you guys. All right, so I've copied and pasted some code. Before we get into this, let me just clean up something here. This index.html, we don't refer to it as that, or else the code will break. We refer to it as this right here, just a general slash for the directory. So we don't really need this. You can include it if you want, but this is what we need to refer to the index.html as. So let me just save this, go back here. Let me just destroy the cache is gone. Service worker, unregister that as well. And I'll show you guys how to do this in the code. It's important you know how to clean up your service workers and how to clean up the cache specifically. But for now, we'll just do it manually. So let me just delete this here. All right. So now to the meat or the bulk of what a service worker does, or what it's mainly used for, which is this sort of proxy in between fetch calls. We listen for the fetch event. So just like we listen for the install event, we're going to listen for the fetch event. We're going to do a console log intercepted just to know that this guy was executed. And then we have an event respond with, which takes a promise. Just like the event.waitUntil took a promise, this respond with takes a promise in the form of anything you want. We're going to do caches. So the caches API has a method called match. All it's doing is it's looking for a key with that stuff, that request object. So a key with the signature of obj, like that. If we get it, it'll be a response. If we don't get it, it'll be an undefined. So we code for that in the code here. And so we have the then with the response. We have these two logs just to know that we're in the fetch listener, and the request that got sent out to either remote or local, the request that we intercepted, and the response we got, either from, again, the cache, or if it's not in the cache, we have to handle if it's not in the cache. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 scenarios to show you. Let's start with the first. So the first says, if there's a local asset that we cached, send that back instead of pinging a remote server. If there's no local asset, then just fetch that asset as though this service worker didn't even run. Just fetch it remotely or locally or whatever. So on the front end, I have fetch of obj. That should come through here. It should get intercepted with the fetch. Since we've cached it, it'll give us back the obj from the cache. It won't go out and create a unique fetch request for that cache. So let me just save here. Let me go back to the console, and let's do this. I don't want to show you guys that just yet. Let me do a delete of this. Let's do a unregister of this, and console.log F5. All right. So I want to show you guys something very important. So we have a service worker successfully registered. We have the assets cached. Watch what happens when I click. When I click, we're supposed to intercept with the fetch call, right? So when I click, what happens? From script.js. So this guy ran right here. It fetched obj. It got obj from somewhere, and then it spit out the response. Now, since these guys didn't run here, we know that it didn't get OBJ from the cache, but why not? I'm clicking the fetch, and this service worker is supposed to be a fetch interceptor. Why is it not intercepting that? Well, just because you register a service worker and install a service worker doesn't mean it's actually activated. It only gets activated once you refresh the page. So if I press F5, let me clear this first. So Control L, we do an F5, and we get the intercepted. So what did it intercept? Well, when the page first loads, it loads the index.html. It fetches the index.html. The index.html embeds a script.js, so it has to fetch the script.js. That's where we're getting the intercepted automatically. So it fetched the script.js, and that's the response we got from the little fetch listener right here. So now what happens when I click the page? There we go. We intercepted the request. The request was for the obj.png. We got the response from the cache, and the cache gave us back the cached obj.png, not a fresh fetch. So that's the first way. I'm going to show you how to use a service worker. So let me uncomment this. Comment that. Let me uncomment these lines. So what we're going to do with these lines, we're just going to say any sort of fetch we make, script.js, index.html, return that response from the cache right here. But if that request has the signature of obj.png, instead of giving back that obj.png here, or making a fresh fetch request right here, I want you to fetch a picture from the internet, from a remote server. In this case, it's the pixum.photos/800 by 800. So let me save. Let me unregister here. Let me cache. Let me delete the cache here. All right, console. F5, so we're doing a fresh install of our service worker. Service worker successfully registered, assets cached. I click, and there's no interception because just because we install and register doesn't mean we're activated. I press F5. All right, so we intercepted the initial script.js. Now what happens when I click and I'm trying to fetch the obj.png? So we have the request sent out from the script.js. We got the response from the cache, but instead of using the response from the cache, we send back this, a picture from the internet, specifically that Pixum photo. So that's another way of using a service worker. You don't have to send them back the data they're expecting. You can send back totally different data types, but just be careful when you send back different data types. If we're fetching an image and the script.js expects an image, but you send back, text data, maybe JSON data, it might blow up the code on the script.js if they're coding for an image. Just to show you that you don't need to send them back what they're requesting. You send them back whatever you want. So let's move on to the third scenario. The third scenario is just like the second scenario, except we're caching the request. So what we're saying with this guy is, and I might not even run it because we don't really need to. Actually, yeah, I'll do that. So what we're saying is when we request or fetch the obj.png, instead of fetching the obj.png, fetch that image from that Pixum site, and don't just send it back as a response. Actually save it in the cache, so the next time we fetch obj.png, instead of going to the internet, we can just go to the cache. So we're just going to create another item in the cache that has the signature of https:// photos whatever. So we do that here with this these lines here. So once we fetch that image from the Pixum site, we have a .then, we have the response from the Pixum site, which is the image, and then we return, again, we have to return a resolved, or excuse me, just a promise. So we return the caches.open, we open the exact same cache, which is v1, and we're just adding in another, let me just do this, we're adding in another key value pair. We do a Shift-Alt-F, there we go. And instead of the cache.add or add all, just cache.put, where the key is the request object, which is this guy right here, and the response is right here. And with the clone the response, when we're setting the response in the cache, that response is only good for this amount of time right here. So it's basically, if we did this right here, if we just said that, we're basically sending in a pointer to a response, but once this guy gets resolved, that pointer gets lost. So we have to clone another copy for the cache, so the cache can have it even though this guy has finished his cycle. So res.clone, like this. So let me save. We go back here, let me unregister the service worker, clear the cache. Clear the cache. So delete. Go back here. We'll do an F5. A fresh install, a register and install of the service worker as it's cached. I click. It still isn't activated. We press F5 to activate. We intercept once. Let me see what happens when we click the mouse now. So we're sending out a fetch request for the obj.png. We got the response from the local cache of obj.png, but instead of sending that back, we now send the pixum, the internet image back. Let's take a look at the cache now. So application, service worker installed, perfect. So the cache is right here. So where is that pixum site? We have the index.html, we have the obj.png, we have the script.js. Well, remember the cache works on key value pairs, the key being the fetch request. So the fetch request is obj.png, but the content of obj.png is the response. So I don't think I even showed you guys what that was. So this is what obj.png is. But because we interrupted that fetch request and we sent back a random image from some pixum site, the value or content of obj.png is now this, a different image. So we've just saved that response from this site right here as the value to obj.png, whereas it was this and should be this, it's now this picture right here. So that's just the, what was that, the third or fourth way? It was a third way of showing you what a service worker can do. So let me just reset our workspace here. So I'm going to do this, uncomment this, and I'll just comment this guy back in. I'll delete the cache. Let me go to service workers, unregister, and let's go to the fourth way. All right, uncomment that. The fourth way would be return other site must be non-cores blocked. All right, so remember when I said the first file that gets fetched is the index.html. What happens if we sent a different site back, so a different index.html? In this case, it's a, let me just show you guys what this site is first. So instead of rewriting or intercepting the obj page, we're going to intercept the index.html, which goes automatic. So let me just show you what this site is. Just a dummy placeholder site for JSON data. So this right here, this itself is an index.html written by whoever wrote this site and just produces this data right here. So what happens if we did this? We're saying return a fetch of this site, which is index.html. So let me save, let me go back, go to console, let me go F5, and there we go. So our site becomes their site. Now, because on their site, they didn't code for a script.js, or at least I don't think they did, we're not getting any sort of requests for script.js. And obviously, if I click, nothing's happening. Because on their site, they don't have this. They don't have an event listener fetching obj. So when you intercept with a different web page, just understand that you lose all of the information in your index.html as well as any script that's linked with your index.html. So your page literally becomes their page. So let's undo this. Let's go to here, not F5, but just comment that in, comment this out. We'll do a save. We'll go back here and we'll unregister and we'll clear the cache as well. Let's do an F5, and of course, our site comes back. Our site actually attaches the script.js, so when I click, we're fetching the obj.png. And so finally, the last guy I have, which is you can send back custom response objects. So like I said, the response objects are literally the HTTP protocol response objects with things like headers and body and all that stuff. So we can send back an empty response like this. So we save, go back, do an F5, not like that. Let me go here. Delete this, console, F5, and there we go. So there's no actual page here because we sent back an empty response. So the first file we fetched is the index.html. Instead of the index.html, we just sent back a blank response. We can even do something like this. I don't know, blah, 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 blah. Save. Let's delete the service worker, unregister. Let's go F5, not like that. There we go, the cache. We have to delete the cache as well. Delete that. There we go, blah, blah, blah. So anyways, just to show you that you can send back custom response objects. Let's reset our workspace. Let's just go to the first one here. service workers, unregister, and we're about to get into how to clear cache manually. And well, before we do that, let's get into upgrading. How do you upgrade a service worker? All right, so to upgrade a service worker, I'm going to show you this. I'm going to create another file in our directory. I'm just going to call it, I don't know, scramble.txt. So I'm going to lie to you for a bit, and I'll tell you why I lied. So in the docs, what it says or how it says to upgrade a service worker is just to increase the version of your cache. So we're just going to say version 2. Actually, let's do this. It's the first one installed. Application, service worker, perfect. And we have the cache storage is not there because we have an F5. Actually, unregister, it's not online. All right, F5. There we go. Service worker is installed, activated. We have the cache of version 1. So let's upgrade to version 2 of the service worker. So we can say version 2. And let's add that file that I just created, the scramble.txt. And let's do this. This will be the version 2. Version 2 got the response. So I'll save this. All right, so we have the version 2 of the service worker's cache right here. But look at this. This is version 1 of the service worker. When you upgrade a service worker, it gets registered, it gets installed, but it doesn't activate until this page goes offline. So if I F5, we're still on the first service worker. The only way I can get off of this service worker is to create a new page or a new tab and delete this one or close this one. Or we can click skip waiting, or we can go into the code here and we can say, so we know we're going to activate the second service worker. We can just do self.skip waiting like this. And that will force, basically it will do this thing for us. Let me just delete that, go here. Let me skip waiting. And now we're on to the second service worker. How do we know that? We got the V2. So when I click, we now have the V2. Whereas when I clicked before, it was the V1. Let's look at the caches quickly, and then I'll tell you why I lied about this. So V2 has the scramble.txt, whereas the version 1 of our service worker doesn't have the scramble.txt. All right, so what did I lie to you about? Well, the docs will say to increase the version of your cache. This is what you should be doing, just to keep track of which service worker you're on, but that's not what the system is doing. All the system is doing in order to differentiate one service worker from another is looking at the file size of your sw.js. So watch what happens when I do this. Let's add another file here. We'll just say eggs.txt. Close this. Actually, let's not even do that. Let's delete this file. Delete that. All right, so this is the second version of our service worker. Nothing's changed except this. Watch. Let me just add this. So in empty comments, this increases the file size. So now the file size of this sw.js increases by however many bytes. I save and we go to right here, application service worker. So this is the second service worker right here. And this is the third service worker right here. So I did this just to illustrate that when you want to upgrade your service worker, it's not a matter of increasing the version or keeping track of the version number of the service worker. The system is literally just looking for or comparing file sizes. But of course, you do this in real life, because if you did this just to indicate your third or fourth service worker, I don't know, it'd be bad programming practices. But just to understand that it's just looking at file size differentials or differences between service workers.js. So how about I show you guys this just to quickly how to use the event.skip waiting. So let's just go back to version 1. Let me delete these service workers. We won't need the scrambled text for the first version. Unregister this. We'll delete both caches. Delete. Delete. And let's go back to this as well. This will be V1. Save. Go back. We have the first version of our service worker installed. Yes, we do. First one right here, 74. There we go. And let me just do a quick check here. V1. All right, let's upgrade to the version 2 without actually clicking on that skip waiting stuff. So version 2, we'll add the scramble.txt. Let me change this to V2. And of course in here, we can do event.skip waiting. Save. And what was the problem? The problem is not event. It's not event.skipwaiting, excuse me. It's self.skipwaiting. Self. Period. There we go. So there's no waiting. We went straight to the 76. And how do we know we're on the second version? I click and we have the V2 stuff. Anyways, that's just how you upgrade a service worker. Let's move on to actually deleting the cache through the code. Just like we skipped waiting through the code, let's delete cache through code. All right, so to delete cache through code, it's relatively easy. I'm just going to copy and paste some code. So just like I told you that just because we register a service worker, install a service worker, doesn't mean it activates. We can also listen for an activate event, and that's where we're going to delete or clean up the cache. So this is a code here. It's relatively simple. What we're going to say is listen for the activate event. Once we activate the actual service worker, we're going to do another wait until, just like this wait until up here with the install. We're going to go through the caches.keys. So all the keys basically being this right here. These are the keys of your cache, V1, V2, not these guys here. This is like the keys in the cache. This is the keys of the cache. That's how you know which cache you're on, V1, V2, or whatever you name it. So go through all those keys. Once we get the keys, we're going to loop through. It's an array. We're going to loop through an array, and then we can delete whatever key we want here. So I'm going to say if the key is equal to V1, we're going to delete that cache. So caches.delete that key. So let's do this. Let's upgrade to the third version. And we'll just omit the scrambled. Let's go to version 3 right here. So now what we're going to do when I save is, and I'll do the self.skipwaiting. So when I save, what we're going to do is we're going to register the version 3. We're going to install the version 3. The version 3's activate listener is going to activate or execute. We're going to go through the caches and we're going to delete the version 1 cache. So what we should have on the back end or in the Chrome tools is the version 2 cache and the version 3 cache saved, but no version 1. So let me Control S. We go back here. And there we go. So it manually deleted the V2 and V3. So if I change this to V2, I save, go back, and it deletes V2. If I go to V3, let's see what happens. Save, go back, and deletes V3. That's because the little life cycle is install, or register first, then install. So install a V3, then activate, delete V3, and then you listen for your fetch calls. So the V3 didn't stand a chance. It got deleted after it got installed here. Anyways, that's how you delete caches through code. So that's going to be it for the video. I know it was a long one, a bit of a complicated one, but that's all a service worker is. It's a file that gets executed in between fetch calls. You don't need to do anything like this install, fetch, activate business, but what else are you going to do with your service worker? Again, you just do console logs, or I don't know what else you could do, probably do some hacks or whatever. Anyways, that's what a service worker is. Leave a like, subscribe if you haven't already subscribed, and I will see you guys in the next one.